In the grim darkness of the far future, there exists a fate worse than death. Picture this: you are a space marine, one of the Emperor's finest warriors, encased in ceramite armor and genetically engineered to know no fear. You have fought across 100 worlds, your name whispered in reverence by your battle brothers. Then comes the wound that changes everything, not death, that merciful release, but something far more terrible. Your body is shattered beyond repair, crushed by a tyrannid's claw or burned by a plasma bolt. Your chapter's apothecaries shake their heads. You should die. You want to die. But they offer you what they call an honor. They will place what remains of you, your torso, your vital organs, your brain, into a cybernetic sarcophagus. You will become a dreadnought, a walking tomb that serves the Emperor forever. Most space marines accept this fate because they know no other way. Service is all they understand. But imagine, just for a moment, that this metal coffin, this walking weapon platform, with your consciousness trapped inside, doesn't stay safely within your chapter's fortress monastery. Imagine it's lost. Cast into the void of space, drifting through the eternal darkness between stars, floating through the hellish unreality of the warp, forgotten and alone for not years, not decades, not even centuries, but thousands of years. This is not a hypothetical scenario in the universe of Warhammer 40,000. This has happened. Space hulks, those massive conglomerations of lost ships, fused together by time and warp energy, have been found containing dreadnoughts, still functioning after millennia adrift. Ancient warriors from the Great Crusade, from the Horus Heresy itself, discovered floating in the darkness, their minds still conscious within their metal prisons, aware of every second of those endless years. Today, we're going to explore what happens to a dreadnought when it's lost in space for thousands of years. We'll examine the physical degradation, the psychological horror, the corruption of the warp, and the ultimate fate of these eternal warriors. This isn't just about the fate of a machine. This is about consciousness, about the price of immortality, about what happens when service to the Emperor becomes an eternity of suffering in the cold void between stars. The technology of eternal servitude. Before we can understand what happens when a dreadnought drifts through space for millennia, we need to understand what a dreadnought actually is. These are not simply large suits of power armor. They are sophisticated life support systems, built around what's left of a space marine's body. When a space marine suffers wounds that would be fatal to any other being, even with their enhanced physiology and redundant organs, the chapter must make a choice. If the warrior is deemed worthy, if their service record justifies the immense expense and effort, they are offered the honor of interment within a dreadnought chassis. This process begins with the apothecaries carefully extracting what's left of the warrior's body. In many cases, this means only the torso, containing the primary organs. Sometimes even less. The head and brain are essential. Everything else can be sacrificed. What remains of the warrior is placed into a cybernetic sarcophagus, an armored shell filled with amniotic fluids that preserve organic tissue. This sarcophagus is equipped with life support systems far more advanced than those in Terminator armor or even the life support systems of Voyage ships. These systems must keep the organic components alive indefinitely. Neural interfaces are implanted directly into the warrior's brain, creating a connection between biological consciousness and mechanical systems. The most crucial component is the Mind Impulse Unit, an archaeotech device that dates back to the dark age of technology. This neural link allows the entombed warrior to control the dreadnought's massive limbs and weapons systems, as if they were their own body. Through optical sensors, they can see. Through audio pickups, they can hear. Through the armor's pressure sensors, they can feel, in a limited way, the impacts of enemy fire and the recoil of their own weapons. But here's the horrifying reality, that few outside the chapter's inner circles understand this connection is never perfect. The entombed warrior experiences a constant state of sensory deprivation. They cannot truly feel temperature. They cannot smell. They cannot taste. The world reaches them through layers of mechanical translation, always at a remove, always filtered. Every sensation is processed through the machine, interpreted, and then fed to their organic brain in a form it can understand. The Dreadnought's power source is typically an adaptable thermic reactor for the common Castroferrum pattern, or the more advanced atomantic arc reactors for the ancient Contemptor patterns. These reactors are built to function for centuries, perhaps even millennia if properly maintained. They generate power not just for the weapon systems and servo motors, but for the critical life support systems that keep the organic component alive. The amniotic fluids that fill the sarcophagus serve multiple purposes. They cushion the organic remains against the shock of combat. They provide nutrients directly to the tissue. They remove waste products. They contain chemical compounds that slow cellular aging and prevent tissue degradation. In essence, the warrior within is kept in a state of suspended animation, aging at a fraction of the normal rate. When not in battle, dreadnoughts are kept in stasis chambers, their systems powered down to the minimum necessary to maintain life. This serves two purposes. It preserves the irreplaceable technology, and it protects the warrior's sanity. Extended consciousness within a dreadnought causes profound psychological problems. Confusion, dyschronometria, a distorted sense of time passing, lethargy, and eventually, senility. The human mind, even one enhanced and conditioned as thoroughly as a space marine's, was never meant to exist in such isolation. Different patterns of dreadnoughts have different capabilities for sustaining their occupants. The Castroferrum pattern, the most common in the 41st millennium, uses well understood technology that can be maintained by most chapter tech marines. The Contemptor pattern, a relic from the Great Crusade, incorporates technologies that are only partially understood in the current age. Some of these ancient machines have sophisticated self-repair systems, automated maintenance protocols that can keep them functional even without external intervention. The most advanced dreadnought chassis, those built during the height of the Great Crusade or even earlier, were designed with redundancy upon redundancy. Multiple power sources, backup life support systems, emergency protocols that could sustain the occupant even if the primary systems failed. These machines were built to last not just centuries, but potentially millennia. But every system, no matter how advanced, no matter how redundant, degrades over time. And when that time is measured not in years, but in thousands of years, when the environment is not a controlled fortress monastery, but the endless void of space, when there is no tech, marine to perform maintenance rituals and apply sacred unguents, the degradation becomes inevitable. Understanding this technology, understanding what sustains the warrior within, helps us grasp the true horror of what happens when a dreadnought is lost in space. Because the life support systems, the power generators, the neural interfaces, all of these were designed with the assumption that the dreadnought would be maintained, that it would rest in stasis between battles, that it would be cared for by the chapter's servants. None of these systems were designed for what actually happens when a dreadnought is cast into the void and left to drift for millennia. The infinite dark, understanding deep space. To comprehend what happens to a dreadnought lost in the void, we must first understand the environment of deep space itself. This is not the romanticized vision of space from fiction. This is a realm of absolute extremes, of physics operating at scales and intensities that defy human intuition. Space is not empty. This is a common misconception. The void between stars is filled with radiation, with particles moving at incredible velocities, with electromagnetic fields and the remnants of ancient supernovae. A dreadnought floating through this environment faces threats that would destroy lesser machines in moments. The first and most persistent threat is radiation. Deep space is saturated with it. Galactic cosmic rays, high-energy particles that have been accelerated to near light speeds by events like supernovae and active galactic nuclei, sleeting through the void in every direction. These particles carry enormous energies, far beyond what's encountered on planetary surfaces. When they strike matter, they don't just deposit energy, they can transmute atoms, creating entirely new elements through nuclear reactions. Solar radiation varies depending on proximity to stars, but even in the depths between solar systems, there's background radiation left over from the Big Bang itself. closer to stars. Solar flares can release bursts of charged particles that would overwhelm the shielding of most spacecraft. A dreadnought drifting through a stellar system during a major solar event would be bathed in radiation intense enough to corrupt electronic systems, to damage the delicate neural interfaces that connect the pilot's brain to the machine. The ceramite armor of a dreadnought provides some protection. This composite material was developed during the dark age of technology specifically to resist radiation and extreme temperatures. But it's not perfect. Over time, cosmic rays penetrate even ceramite, causing cumulative damage to systems beneath. The reactor shielding, the neural interface circuits, the life support systems. All of these face constant bombardment from particles that can pass through matter as if it barely exists. Temperature in space is a concept that doesn't work the way most people think. Without an atmosphere to conduct heat, there's no single temperature of space. Instead, objects in the void exchange heat only through radiation. The side of a dreadnought facing a star would heat up, absorbing energy from the star's light. The side facing away would radiate heat into the void, cooling toward absolute zero. This creates thermal stress. The metal components of the dreadnought expand when heated, contract when cooled. Over years, this cycling causes metal fatigue, creates microfractures in joints and seals. Over centuries, these microfractures grow. Over millennia, they can cause catastrophic failures as components literally break apart from the stress of constant expansion and contraction. In the shadow of a star, or in the depths between stellar systems, the temperature approaches that of deep space itself, around 2.7 Kelvin, just above absolute zero. At these temperatures, materials behave differently. Metals become brittle, lubricants freeze solid, electronic components that weren't designed for such extremes begin to malfunction. But perhaps more insidious than radiation or temperature is the constant bombardment by micrometeoroids. These tiny particles, some no larger than grains of sand, move through space at velocities measured in kilometers per second. When they impact armor, they don't just dent it. They vaporize on contact, creating craters and releasing energy equivalent to small explosions. A dreadnought floating through space for thousands of years would be struck by millions of these particles. Each impact is tiny, barely noticeable, but they accumulate. The armor develops pitting, rough patches where the smooth ceramite has been worn away. Sensors become clouded as their lenses are scarred by impacts. Eventually, critical systems can be breached not by any single catastrophic strike, but by the accumulated damage of millions of tiny impacts over vast spans of time. The vacuum itself presents challenges. In the absence of atmosphere, materials outgas. Volatile compounds escape from plastics and composites. This outgassing can contaminate optical systems, coat sensors, interfere with delicate mechanisms. The lack of air also means there's no medium for heat dissipation except radiation, making thermal management a critical challenge. Electromagnetic radiation pervades space. Not just light from stars, but radio waves, X-rays, gamma rays, the entire electromagnetic spectrum. This radiation can induce currents in electronic systems, causing errors in data storage, corrupting the programming of cogitators, slowly degrading the very software that runs the dreadnought systems. And then there's the more exotic physics of deep space. Gravitational fields from distant stars and planets, creating subtle tides that stress the dreadnought's structure over time. Magnetic fields that can induce eddy currents in conductive materials. High-energy phenomena like gamma-ray bursts that, while rare, release more energy in seconds than our sun will produce in its entire lifetime. A dreadnought lost in this environment is subjected to all of these stresses simultaneously and continuously. There's no respite, no safe harbor. The void is relentless. It doesn't actively attack the machine with the fury of enemy weapons. Instead, it erodes, it degrades, it slowly and inexorably wears away at every system, every component, every part that keeps the warrior inside alive and conscious. The universe, viewed from the perspective of a dreadnought drifting through it, is not a place of wonder. It's a hostile environment operating at scales of time and distance that mock human understanding. Stars die, galaxies collide, and through it all, the dreadnought floats, a mote of metal and consciousness in an ocean of darkness, subjected to forces that were never meant to affect something capable of thought, of feeling, of suffering. Cast into the void. How dreadnoughts are lost. The question must be asked, how does a dreadnought, these treasured relics carefully guarded by their chapters, end up lost in space for thousands of years? The answer reveals much about the nature of warfare in the 41st millennium and the cruel randomness that governs existence in the Imperium of man. Space hoax are perhaps the most common scenario. These massive conglomerations of ships and debris drift through the warp and occasionally emerge into real space, bringing with them whatever horrors have made these twisted labyrinths their home. Genestealers, orcs, chaos cultists, daemons, all manner of threats infest space hulks, making them priority targets for space marine boarding actions. When a chapter deploys terminators and dreadnoughts to clear a space hulk, they're entering an environment of absolute unpredictability. The hulk is not a single ship, but dozens or hundreds fused together by time and warp energy. Corridors lead nowhere. Gravity varies randomly. The very geometry of the structure defies rational physics. In such an environment, squads can become separated, lost in the labyrinthine passages. A dreadnought might be advancing through what appears to be a stable corridor when the hulk suddenly shifts, ancient servos activating or warp energies causing reality itself to reconfigure. A passageway closes, sealing the dreadnought in a section that becomes isolated from the rest of the boarding force. The space marines search, but the hulk is vast, kilometers long, and time is always critical in such operations. Eventually they must withdraw, leaving their brother behind, entombed not just in his sarcophagus, but in the dead ship itself. The space hulk then drifts back into the warp, carrying the dreadnought with it. Time in the warp doesn't flow consistently. The hulk might spend what seems like years in the Imperium, emerging centuries later in a completely different part of the galaxy. Or it might be subjectively longer, centuries passing within the warp, while only decades pass in real space. During this time, the dreadnought remains conscious, sealed in darkness, unable to move, listening to the groaning of twisted metal and the whispers that leak through from the Imperium. Ship disasters represent another common scenario. When a space marine vessel is destroyed in void combat, not all of it is vaporized. Large sections can be blown clear of the explosion, sent tumbling through space by the force of the detonation. If a dreadnought was stationed in one of these sections, perhaps standing ready in a deployment bay or secured in a transport hold, it might survive the initial destruction only to be cast adrift. Without power to its orientation thrusters, without any means of propulsion, the dreadnought simply floats wherever the laws of physics take it. In the depths of space, far from any gravity well, it might drift for thousands of years without encountering anything. The warrior inside remains conscious, watching the stars slowly rotate around them, unable to do anything but think and remember, and slowly lose their grip on sanity. Warp storms can scatter entire fleets across light years of space. A ship entering the warp for what should be a routine transit might encounter a storm that tears it apart, scattering its components across real space like seeds from a pod. A dreadnought aboard such a vessel might find itself suddenly ejected into the void, the ship around it simply gone, dissolved by warp energies or transported elsewhere. Boarding actions against enemy vessels present their own risks. When space marines board a chaos warship or a Xenos craft, they deploy their most powerful assets, including dreadnoughts. But void combat is unpredictable. A ship might detonate its own reactor rather than allow capture, destroying itself and everything aboard. Or it might attempt an emergency warp translation with boarders still inside, jumping blindly into the Imperium. If the ship is destroyed, debris fields scatter across thousands of kilometers. If it makes an emergency jump, it might emerge from the warp structurally compromised, breaking apart upon re-entry to real space. In either scenario, a dreadnought could be separated from its chapter, floating alone in a debris field, or stranded aboard a section of ship that's been split from the main hull. There are more exotic scenarios as well. Spatial anomalies, regions where real space and the warp bleed together. can trap ships and their contents in temporal loops, or transport them vast distances instantaneously. A dreadnought might be caught in such an anomaly, experiencing centuries in moments or moments stretched across centuries, emerging in a time and place far removed from when and where it entered. Necron weapons that phase targets out of existence might not always destroy their targets completely. A dreadnought struck by such a weapon could be partially phased into a pocket dimension, existing in a state between reality and unreality, conscious but unable to interact with either realm. The most tragic scenarios involve simple accidents. A dreadnought being transported between ships via teleportation when the signal is disrupted, materializing not aboard the destination vessel, but in the void between ships. A drop pod deployment gone wrong, the pod's trajectory calculated incorrectly, sending the dreadnought not toward the planet's surface, but out into the system's Kuiper belt. A malfunctioning grav lift releasing a dreadnought from a ship's hold while in orbit. The massive walker tumbling away from the vessel before anyone realizes what's happened. In every scenario, the common thread is separation. The dreadnought is cut off from its chapter, from any hope of recovery, from any possibility of fulfilling its purpose in battle. It becomes a piece of sophisticated technology, containing a living, conscious mind, drifting through an environment that was never meant to sustain life, subjected to forces that will slowly but inevitably destroy even the most advanced machine. The Imperium is vast beyond human comprehension. Millions of worlds, quadrillions of human souls, spread across a galaxy so large that light takes 100,000 years to cross it. In such vastness, in the chaos of constant warfare against enemies that threaten extinction, the loss of a single dreadnought, tragic as it is, becomes a footnote, a statistic, a name added to the rolls of the lost and presumed destroyed. But the dreadnought doesn't know it's a statistic. The warrior inside doesn't understand that they've become a piece of data in some administrative archive, marked as destroyed in action, their gene, seed written off as lost. All they know is that they're alone, that the darkness surrounds them, that the stars wheel overhead in patterns that slowly, over years and centuries and millennia, shift as they drift through the void. This is how dreadnoughts are lost, through accidents, through the chaos of battle, through the cruel randomness that governs existence in a universe where the gods themselves are malevolent. Each loss is a tragedy. Each loss is one more consciousness, condemned to an existence of isolation and degradation, floating through the infinite dark until the systems that sustain them finally, mercifully, fail. The slow death of systems. When we consider a dreadnought's survival in space over thousands of years, we must examine the physical degradation of its systems in detail. This isn't a simple matter of batteries running down or fuel exhausting. The dreadnought is a complex integration of technologies, some dating back to the dark age of technology, many of which are only partially understood even by the tech priests who maintain them. Each system faces its own unique challenges when subjected to millennia in the void. The reactor is the heart of everything. Without power, life support fails, the pilot dies, and the dreadnought becomes just another piece of debris. The Castroferrum pattern uses adaptable thermic reactors, which generate power through controlled nuclear reactions. These reactors are designed to operate for centuries with minimal maintenance. But centuries is not millennia, and maintenance is not something a lone dreadnought drifting in space can receive. The reactor's fuel, typically refined promethium or more exotic compounds for older patterns, depletes over time. The rate of depletion depends on power consumption. If the dreadnought systems enter a minimal power state, drawing only enough energy to maintain basic life support and preserve the pilot's consciousness, the fuel might last for thousands of years. But if weapon systems remain active, if sensors continue full spectrum scanning, if any number of non-essential systems continue to draw power, the fuel reserves deplete much faster. Radiation from cosmic rays damages the reactor's control systems. The delicate balance of the nuclear reaction depends on precisely calibrated sensors and control mechanisms. As these systems accumulate radiation damage, they begin to drift out of calibration. The reaction becomes less efficient producing less power for the same amount of fuel consumed. Or worse, it becomes unstable, risking a catastrophic failure that would either shut down completely or potentially cause a meltdown. The reactor's shielding, designed to protect the pilot from radiation, also degrades. Cosmic rays transmute atoms within the shielding material, changing its composition and reducing its effectiveness. Over millennia, what was once adequate shielding becomes inadequate, exposing the pilot and the Dreadnought systems to increasing levels of radiation from the reactor itself. The life support systems face their own challenges. The amniotic fluids that preserve the pilot's organic remains must be recycled constantly. Filtration systems remove waste products, chemical regulators maintain pH balance, nutrient dispensers add what the tissue needs to survive. These are complex systems with moving parts, with filters that clog, with chemical reservoirs that deplete. In a fortress monastery, Marines regularly service these systems, replacing filters, replenishing chemical stocks, performing maintenance rituals that keep everything functioning. In the void, there is no maintenance. Filters clog and are never replaced. Chemical reservoirs run dry and are never refilled. The systems continue to operate until they simply can't anymore. The organic tissue itself faces degradation. The chemicals in the amniotic fluid are designed to slow aging, but they cannot stop it entirely. The Space Marine's enhanced biology helps. Redundant organs and genetic modifications mean that even significant organ failure doesn't immediately result in death. But over thousands of years, even enhanced tissue breaks down. Muscles atrophy from total disuse. Bones become brittle from the lack of gravity and stress. Organs slowly fail, one after another, until only the most critical systems remain functional. The brain itself, that precious component that contains the warrior's consciousness, degrades. Neurons die and are not replaced. Neural pathways break down. Memory begins to fail. The neural interface, that mind impulse unit that connects brain to machine, faces its own degradation. This is ancient technology, not fully understood even by its maintainers. The interface relies on quantum, scale interactions between biological neurons and mechanical systems. Radiation at the quantum level causes decoherence, disrupting these delicate interactions. As the interface degrades, the pilot's connection to their mechanical body weakens. What once felt like moving their own limbs becomes sluggish, imprecise. Sensory input becomes clouded, harder to interpret. Eventually, the interface might fail completely, leaving the pilot conscious but unable to interact with the world outside their sarcophagus. Trapped within their own skull, sensing nothing, hearing nothing, seeing nothing. Just existing in absolute sensory deprivation for however long their life support continues to function. The armor itself, that ceramite shell that protects everything inside, erodes under the constant bombardment of micrometeoroids. Each impact is tiny, but they accumulate. After 1,000 years, millions of impacts have scarred the surface. After 5,000 years, the armor begins to thin in places, develop weak points. After 10,000 years, breaches might form, exposing internal systems to the vacuum. Shields and joints, made from materials designed to remain flexible across extreme temperatures, become brittle. The constant thermal cycling, heating and cooling as the Dreadnought tumbles through space, causes these materials to crack. Hydraulic fluid, if any remains after millennia, leaks out into the vacuum where it instantly freezes or boils away depending on temperature. Servos and actuators, the mechanical muscles that allow the Dreadnought to move, seize up without maintenance. Lubricants break down and evaporate in vacuum. Metal grinds on metal, wearing away bearings and gears. Cold welding can occur in vacuum, where metal surfaces press together with no atmosphere between them can actually fuse at the atomic level. The electronics suffer perhaps most severely from radiation. Computer systems, even those built with hardened components, accumulate errors over time. Cosmic rays flip bits in memory, corrupting data. Control systems begin to malfunction, sending erratic commands to servos and weapons systems. The Dreadnought's machine spirit, if one believes in such things, becomes confused, senile, as damaged as the organic brain it's theoretically protecting. Optical systems cloud and crack. the lenses that allow the pilot to see the outside world, accumulate a haze from micrometeoroid impacts and radiation damage. What began as perfect clarity becomes increasingly obscured, like looking through frosted glass. Colors shift as the optical elements degrade, the universe taking on strange hues as the pilot's ability to perceive reality accurately deteriorates along with their sensors. The weapons systems, though unused, still degrade. Plasma coils crack from thermal stress. Ammunition, if any was loaded, experiences molecular breakdown. The propellant in bolter shells deteriorates, becoming unstable or inert. Power conduits develop shorts. Targeting systems drift out of alignment. All of this degradation happens slowly, over time scales difficult for the human mind to grasp. In the 1st century, the changes are barely noticeable. The Dreadnought functions almost as well as it did when first lost. By the 2nd century, small problems begin to manifest. A servo that's slightly sluggish. A sensor that occasionally gives erratic readings. By the 5th century, these small problems have accumulated into noticeable degradation. By the 1st millennium, significant systems are failing. The life support is working harder to maintain the same level of function. The reactor's efficiency has dropped noticeably. The neural interface has developed lag, delays between the pilot's thought and the system's response. By the 2nd millennium, the Dreadnought is clearly dying. Systems failing one after another, the pilot experiencing an increasingly distorted and limited connection to the world outside. And yet, throughout all of this, the core life support might continue to function. The reactor, even degraded, might produce enough power to keep the amniotic fluids circulating, to maintain the minimal chemical balance necessary for the brain to remain alive. The pilot's consciousness might persist even as every other system fails, leaving them aware but unable to sense anything, unable to interact with anything, just existing in an eternal now of absolute nothingness. This is the slow death of systems. Not a catastrophic failure, not a moment of destruction, but a gradual fading. Each system quietly giving up, its redundancies exhausted, its tolerances exceeded, until nothing remains but the bare minimum necessary to sustain the spark of life in the organic brain, floating in amniotic fluid, in a metal shell drifting through the infinite dark. The fracturing of the mind. We must now address the psychological reality of consciousness, trapped within a failing dreadnought for thousands of years. This goes beyond simple isolation or sensory deprivation. This is an experience so far outside the bounds of what evolution prepared the human mind to handle that it breaks down in ways we can barely conceive. Consider first the question of time perception. A space marine's mind is conditioned and enhanced, capable of processing information faster than a baseline human, of maintaining focus under conditions that would shatter normal human psychology. But even this enhanced mind was never meant to experience millennia of consciousness. In the first years, the Dreadnought pilot likely maintains something close to normal time perception. They count the seconds, the minutes, the hours. They track the slow rotation of stars outside their hull, using the changing stellar positions to mark the passage of days and months. They remember their chapter, their battle brothers, the battles they fought. They cling to these memories like anchors, ways of maintaining their sense of self in the absolute isolation. But human minds, even enhanced ones, are not designed for this level of temporal awareness. We evolved to experience time in contexts of days and seasons, years and lifetimes measured in decades. The concept of 1,000 years is almost meaningless to us experientially. We can understand it intellectually, but we cannot feel it, cannot truly grasp what that duration means. As years stretch into decades, the pilot's time perception begins to distort. With no external markers, except the infinitely slow movement of stars, no circadian rhythm, no sleep-wake cycles in any natural sense, time becomes fluid. Hours might feel like days. Days might compress into what feels like hours. The mind, desperate for structure, begins to impose its own rhythms that have no relationship to external reality. Research into sensory deprivation in baseline humans shows that even a few hours in isolation can cause significant psychological effects. Hallucinations, both visual and auditory, become common after just a day or two. The mind, deprived of external stimuli, begins to generate its own experiences. Time perception distorts dramatically. 3 hours might subjectively feel like 30. Now extend that not to hours or days, but to centuries. The Dreadnought pilot experiences the most extreme sensory deprivation imaginable. If their optical systems fail, they exist in absolute darkness. If their audio systems fail, in absolute silence. Even if these systems continue to function, what is there to see except the unchanging stars? What is there to hear except the mechanical hum of their own systems? The mind rebels against this. It cannot accept an existence of such emptiness, so it fills the void with generated experiences. The pilot begins to hallucinate, but these are not brief episodes. These are sustained alternate realities that the damaged brain constructs to protect itself from the horror of its actual situation. They might hallucinate that they're back in their chapter's fortress monastery, speaking with battle brothers who have been dead for centuries. They might relive battles they fought before their interment, experiencing them over and over with increasingly distorted details. They might construct entirely fictional scenarios, alternative lives they never lived, realities that never existed. The line between these hallucinations and what passes for reality becomes blurred. Which memories are real? Which are constructed? After 1,000 years, can the pilot even tell the difference? The past becomes a shifting landscape of uncertain authenticity, memory editing and re-editing itself with each recall until the original experiences are completely obscured. The concept of self begins to fragment. Who is the pilot? They were once a space marine with a name, a history, a place in their chapter's hierarchy. But that person lived and died centuries ago. The consciousness that remains, has it become something else? Is it still the same individual, or merely a pattern of thought that happens to contain some memories of that individual? Philosophers have long debated the nature of personal identity, whether we remain the same person over time or are constantly changing. For the Dreadnought pilot, this question becomes urgent and terrible. Every cell in what's left of their organic body has been replaced multiple times over thousands of years. Their memories are corrupted and uncertain. Their personality has been fundamentally altered by experiences no one was ever meant to endure. Are they still themselves? Some pilots might cling desperately to their identity, repeating their name, their chapter, their deeds like a mantra. I am brother, Captain Marcus of the Ultramarines. I fought at Kulth. I serve the Emperor. I am Marcus. I am Marcus. I am, over and over, thousands of times, millions of times, the words becoming meaningless sounds, but the repetition itself becoming the only anchor to a sense of self. Others might surrender to the dissolution of identity, accepting that what they were is gone, that what remains is something new and undefined. These pilots might achieve a kind of peace in this acceptance, but it's a peace bought at the cost of everything that made them who they were. The enhanced psychology of a space marine provides some protection. They are conditioned against fear, against despair, against the normal range of human emotional responses. But this conditioning was never designed to handle millennia of isolation. It's like building a dam designed to withstand a flood, but then subjecting it to 1,000 years of continuous pressure. Eventually, even the strongest structure develops cracks. Dyschronometria, the loss of ability to track time, becomes total. The pilot exists in an eternal present, unable to distinguish whether something happened a moment ago or a millennium ago. 'Cause an effect loses meaning when you can't remember the order in which events occurred. Did that servo failure happen before or after the sensor malfunction? Was that hallucination of seeing a battle, brother recent or from centuries past? Emotions begin to strange and distort. Love for fallen brothers becomes an abstract concept, the feeling hollowed out even while the memory of feeling it remains. Rage at enemies becomes a performance, something the pilot knows they should feel but can't quite access anymore. Even the pride that sustained them through their service, that made them accept internment in a dreadnought, becomes a distant echo. In the deepest reaches of time, after many thousands of years, something approaching dissolution might occur. The damaged brain, the corrupted neural pathways, the total erosion of everything that made up a coherent consciousness. These might collapse into something that can't properly be called a mind anymore. Just fragments of thought, half-formed impressions, the ghost of what was once a person. Yet even in this state, there might be suffering. Not coherent enough to be called conscious suffering in the way we understand it, but something more primitive and terrible. The basic biological imperative to survive, the fundamental awareness that this existence is wrong, that continues even when higher thought has broken down completely. Some pilots might go mad in more dramatic ways. The isolation and sensory deprivation could trigger psychosis, causing the pilot to develop paranoid delusions. To believe that everything they experience is a lie, that they're being tested or tortured, that the voices they hear in hallucinations are real entities trying to communicate with them. Others might develop a kind of learned helplessness, so profound that even if they were somehow rescued, even if their dreadnought was recovered and they were brought back to their chapter, they would be unable to respond. The mind has shut down all but the most basic functions, existing in a state of near catatonia as a defense against the unbearable reality of its situation. The tragedy is that consciousness, that spark of awareness, is remarkably resilient. The brain can survive terrible damage and continue to produce something like thought. The life support systems can keep the organic tissue alive for vast spans of time. So the pilot persists, aware enough to suffer, but not destroyed enough to be granted the mercy of oblivion. They float through the void, and the void enters them. And they become less a person and more an echo, less a warrior and more a pattern of degraded thoughts in degraded neurons, less human and more a monument to suffering, to the price of immortality without purpose, to existence extended beyond all meaning into something that should never have been allowed to persist. This is the psychological reality of a dreadnought lost in space for thousands of years. Not a heroic endurance, not a glorious persistence in service to the Emperor, but a descent into a kind of madness so profound and unique that we have no adequate words to describe it. An unwilling immortality that transforms consciousness itself into a form of eternal torture. The warp's patient hunger. Now we must address the corruption that comes not from the material universe, but from the Imperium itself. The warp, that roiling sea of psychic energy that underlies real space, does not forget. It does not ignore. And a dreadnought drifting through space, carrying within it a conscious mind, that mind shining like a beacon in the psychic darkness, is exactly the kind of prize that the entities of the warp hunger for. The relationship between real space and the warp is complex and variable. In some regions, the barrier between the two is thick and strong. In others, it's thin as paper, reality and unreality bleeding together in ways that defy natural law. A dreadnought drifting through space for thousands of years will inevitably pass through regions where the warp's influence is strong. The first sign of warp corruption in a machine is often subtle. Electronics begin to behave erratically in ways that can't be explained by radiation damage or component failure. The machine spirit, that semi-mystical concept that tech priests believe inhabits all technology, becomes agitated, hostile, or simply mad. Displays show impossible images. Sensors detect things that aren't there, or fail to detect things that are. For a dreadnought pilot, this manifests as a growing unreliability in their connection to the machine. The neural interface begins to transmit sensations that have no physical source. They feel pain in limbs they no longer possess. They see colors that don't exist in the electromagnetic spectrum. They hear voices that seem to come from inside their own skull, but speak with tones and inflections that aren't theirs. The warp is not uniform. It has currents, eddies, storms. A dreadnought might drift through real space for centuries with minimal warp influence, then pass through a region where a warp storm has weakened the barrier between dimensions. During these passages, the corruption accelerates dramatically. Daemons, those entities formed from pure warp energy and given coherence by the emotions and beliefs of sentient beings, are drawn to consciousness. A human mind, especially one as strong-willed as a space marine's, shines in the warp like a lighthouse. But a dreadnought's pilot is peculiarly vulnerable. They're already isolated, already psychologically damaged, already uncertain of what's real and what's hallucination. When a daemon reaches out through the weakened barrier, when it whispers to the pilot, how do they distinguish it from their own thoughts? How do they know that the voice suggesting ways to end their suffering isn't just another manifestation of their damaged psyche? The daemon doesn't need to be subtle. It can be patient, working over decades or centuries to slowly corrupt the pilot's thoughts. The corruption might be ideological first. The daemon whispers doubts about the emperor, about the Imperium, about the purpose of all the suffering they've endured. It questions the virtues they were taught, suggests that their loyalty was exploited, that they were used and then discarded when they became inconvenient to maintain. For a pilot who has drifted in the void for 2,000 years, who has experienced millennia of isolation and degradation, these whispers might find fertile ground. What has the Emperor done for them? Where was the chapter when they needed rescue? If the Imperium truly valued them, wouldn't someone have come looking? The daemon doesn't lie. Exactly. It takes the truth of their abandonment and twists it, uses it to chip away at the faith that has sustained the pilot through their ordeal. Physical corruption follows ideological corruption. The warp begins to directly affect the Dreadnought's physical structure. Metal takes on disturbing qualities, developing growths that look organic, surfaces that feel wrong to sensors designed to detect material properties. The clean lines of Imperial technology become twisted, baroque, decorated with imagery that seems to shift when not directly observed. The amniotic fluids that preserve the pilot's organic remains might become contaminated with warp energies, taking on properties that fluids shouldn't possess. They might begin to glow with sickly light, or develop a consciousness of their own, or simply become actively hostile to the life they're supposed to sustain. The pilot's organic body undergoes mutation. Tumors develop that aren't cancer in any medical sense, but growths of warp-infused flesh. Extra organs appear that serve no biological function. The brain itself might be restructured, neural pathways rewired not by disease, but by the will of entities that exist outside normal causality. These mutations can be painful, each change announced by agony that the pilot cannot escape, but they can also be insidious, changing the pilot at such a fundamental level that they don't recognize what they're becoming. The modifications feel natural, feel right, feel like an improvement over what they were before. Time in the warp doesn't flow consistently. A dreadnought that passes through a region of strong warp influence might experience temporal distortion. Subjectively, they might experience years in moments, or moments that stretch into years. When they emerge back into regions of stable real space, they find that time has passed differently than they expected. This temporal confusion compounds the psychological damage. The pilot loses all sense of how long they've been drifting. They might believe it's been a few years when it's been millennia, or vice versa. Their attempts to maintain a sense of time, already compromised by isolation, collapse completely under the strain of warp-induced temporal distortion. The most insidious corruption is the one that offers relief. A daemon might genuinely offer to end the pilot's suffering, and it might even be telling the truth. It could show them how to shut down the life support, how to finally die after millennia of unwilling immortality. But the price is always the same: the pilot's soul, claimed by the daemon's patron god in the moment of death. Some pilots, broken by their experience, might accept this bargain. After all, what is a soul compared to the immediate promise of ending eternal suffering? What does damnation matter when they've already experienced what feels like hell? The daemon gets what it wanted, and the pilot gets the peace they've craved for millennia. But others resist. Even corrupted, even mutated beyond recognition, even reduced to a barely coherent consciousness floating in a shell of twisted metal, they cling to their oaths. They are space marines, and space marines do not surrender. They cannot. It's not in them. The conditioning, the genetic modifications, the fundamental restructuring of their psyche, these survive even when everything else has been stripped away. These pilots who resist become something unique and terrible. Dreadnoughts that have drifted through the warp for millennia, accumulated physical and psychic corruption, but retained enough of their original nature to resist complete corruption. They're no longer fully loyal to the Imperium. They can't be. The damage is too extensive. But neither are they servants of chaos. There's something in between, something undefined. Ancient warriors who have been transformed into entities that don't fit into the neat categories of the galaxy's endless war. When these corrupted, but not fully fallen dreadnoughts are eventually recovered, they pose a terrible question for those who find them. What do you do with a warrior who has served for thousands of years, who has endured torments beyond imagination, but who has been changed by the warp into something that might be dangerous? Do you grant them the mercy of destruction? Do you attempt to salvage what remains of their loyalty? Do you study them to understand how the warp corrupts even the most advanced Imperial technology? There are no good answers. Every choice is a compromise. Every decision made in ignorance of what truly occurred during those millennia in the void. The Dreadnought itself might not be able to explain, its memories too corrupted, its communication systems too degraded, its very mind too altered to convey the truth of its experience. The warp is patient. It doesn't need to immediately corrupt everything it touches. It can wait centuries, millennia, working slowly to undermine faith, to introduce doubt, to twist metal and flesh gradually until the transformation is complete. A dreadnought drifting through space for thousands of years has time, more time than it could ever want, and the warp has all the time in the universe to work its corruption. This is perhaps the most tragic aspect of a lost dreadnought's fate. Even if they survive the physical degradation, even if their systems continue to function and their consciousness persists, the warp's influence ensures that what survives is not what was lost. The warrior who went missing is not the same as whatever is eventually found. They cannot be. The void and the warp have changed them at a fundamental level, rewritten them from the level of atoms and souls upward, until what remains is something new and strange and terrible. The final darkness at some point, inevitably, the systems that sustain the pilot fail completely. This moment might come after 1,000 years or after 10,000. It might be sudden, a critical component finally surrendering to accumulated damage, or gradual, a slow diminishment of function until nothing remains. But it comes. It always comes. The reactor is usually the first critical failure, when the fuel is finally exhausted, or when the control systems can no longer maintain the reaction, power output drops. At first, this might be manageable. Non-essential systems are automatically shut down, power diverted to life support and critical neural interfaces. The Dreadnought becomes even more isolated as sensors go dark, communication systems fall silent, and weapon systems power down. But as power continues to decline, choices must be made if the automated systems are still functional enough to make them. Heating is sacrificed first. The temperature inside the sarcophagus begins to drop. The pilot, reduced to just a brain and perhaps a few other organs floating in amniotic fluid, starts to experience the cold. It's not like surface cold, not like winter on a planetary surface. This is the absolute cold of the void, temperature approaching absolute zero. As the cold penetrates the sarcophagus, the amniotic fluids begin to freeze. Ice crystals form, sharp and growing, piercing through what's left of organic tissue. The pain would be extraordinary if the pilot is still conscious enough to feel pain. But at these temperatures, neural activity slows, thoughts become sluggish, consciousness dims. The alternative to cold is that power to heating continues but circulation fails. The fluids become stagnant. Waste products accumulate, nutrients are not replenished. The pilot's tissue begins to die from the inside out, cells succumbing to toxic accumulation, organs shutting down one after another in a cascade of biological failure. The neural interface fails at some point in this process. The connection between the pilot's brain and the Dreadnought's sensors, already degraded over millennia, finally collapses completely. The pilot is sealed within their own skull, consciousness reduced to just the internal sensations of their own failing body. They might experience this final isolation with something approaching relief. After millennia of being bombarded with false sensations from degraded sensors, of hallucinations mixing with corrupted input, the absolute purity of sensory deprivation could feel clean, simple, honest in its totality. Or they might experience it as the ultimate horror. After all the struggle to maintain awareness of the outside world, after using their connection to their mechanical body as the last anchor to a sense of self, that connection is severed. They're reduced to pure consciousness with no input, no output, just existing in a void more absolute than the physical void outside their hull. How long does consciousness persist after the neural interface fails? How long can a brain function without fresh nutrients, without waste removal, just running on whatever reserves remain in the degraded tissue? For a baseline human, minutes at most. For a space marine, with their enhanced physiology and redundant systems, perhaps longer, but not much longer. The enhancements that allow them to survive terrible wounds, to function with organs failing, these cannot overcome the fundamental requirements of biological function. There might be a moment of clarity in the final seconds. The dying brain, flooded with whatever chemicals remain in its dying tissue, might experience a sudden lucidity. The pilot, perhaps for the first time in millennia, sees their situation clearly, understands fully what has happened to them, comprehends the totality of their experience. What do they think in that final moment? Do they curse the Emperor for allowing this fate? Do they praise him for finally granting release? Do they think of their chapter, their brothers, the life they lived before interment? Or is thought too scattered, too damaged by millennia of isolation and degradation to form anything coherent? We cannot know. There's no record of these final thoughts because the pilots who experience them die with their dreadnoughts. Their consciousness extinguishes like a candle flame. The complex pattern of neural activity that constituted a person simply ceasing to exist, leaving behind only dead tissue in a metal shell drifting through the void. But death itself might not be the end. In the universe of Warhammer 40k, souls are real. They're not metaphors or religious concepts, but actual entities that can be measured, manipulated, and consumed. When a person dies, their soul enters the warp, where its fate depends on many factors: the strength of the soul, the beliefs of the person, the presence or absence of protective entities. For a space marine, even one who has drifted in isolation for millennia, the soul is strong, enhanced by genetic modification, sustained by unshakable faith. It should theoretically pass to the Emperor upon death, joining him in some fashion that allows continued service even beyond mortality. But what if the pilot has been corrupted? What if millennia of warp exposure has left marks on their soul, has attracted the attention of entities that claim ownership? What if doubt has crept in, eroding the faith that should protect them? Their soul might instead be claimed by one of the chaos gods, dragged into the warp to experience torments that make their physical suffering seem mild by comparison. Or perhaps worst of all, what if the soul simply dissolves into the warp, consumed by the ambient psychic energies, scattered and destroyed? No afterlife with the Emperor, no damnation in service to chaos, just oblivion. The complete cessation of existence at every level, physical and spiritual. The Dreadnought shell itself continues to exist. It becomes just another piece of debris, one more object among countless trillions drifting through the void. The sophisticated systems that once sustained life become meaningless collections of atoms. The armor that protected a warrior becomes an empty tomb. Eventually, even the physical structure will degrade beyond recognition. Given enough time, billions of years perhaps, micrometeoroid impacts will erode even ceramite. The exotic materials that made up the reactor core will undergo radioactive decay. The complex organic molecules that were once a space marine's brain will break down into their component elements, until nothing remains that could be identified as having once been alive. But we're speaking now of time scales beyond human comprehension, beyond even the lifespan of civilizations or species. In the more immediate term, centuries and millennia rather than eons. The Dreadnought remains intact enough to be recognized for what it is. It drifts through the darkness, a sarcophagus containing a corpse, a monument to suffering. a warning about the price of attempting to cheat death through technology. The warrior inside achieved a kind of immortality through their interment in the Dreadnought. They served the Emperor far longer than any baseline human could. But the final decades or centuries or millennia of that extended existence were spent in conditions that no one should ever experience. This is the final darkness. Not a glorious last stand, not a heroic sacrifice, but a quiet extinguishing of consciousness in absolute isolation. The warrior dies alone, light years from their brothers. Their death unmarked and unmourned, because no one knows it has occurred. Their gene seed, that precious genetic legacy that should have been harvested and implanted in a new recruit, dies with them, lost to the chapter forever. In the Imperium's vast bureaucracy, they might still be listed as active, a name on a roster somewhere. Or they might have been marked as destroyed in action centuries or millennia ago. Their absence long since accepted, their replacement already serving in some distant war zone. Either way, the universe continues without them, the Great War grinds on. And one more consciousness has been extinguished in service to an emperor who may not even notice its passing. This is what happens when the final darkness comes for a dreadnought lost in space. This is the ultimate fate of consciousness that has endured beyond all reason. Preserved by technology that was never meant to sustain life for so long under such conditions. This is the price of immortality without purpose, of existence without meaning, of suffering that continues until the very mechanisms that enable consciousness finally fail. The darkness is patient. It doesn't rush. It waits for systems to degrade, for power to fade, for life to finally surrender to entropy. And when it claims the pilot's consciousness, it does so gently, almost mercifully, like sleep after a day that has lasted thousands of years. The pilot slips away into nothing, and the void reclaims what the void took so long ago, and the dreadnought drifts on. Empty now, just metal and ceramite, and the fading echo of what was once a warrior who served the Emperor unto death and beyond. Salvage and recovery, despite the vastness of space, and the apparent impossibility of finding a single dreadnought among the countless light years of void. Recovery does sometimes occur. Space hulks emerge from the warp, bringing with them whatever has been trapped within. Rogue traders exploring uncharted regions stumble across debris fields. The Adeptus Mechanicus, always hungry for ancient technology, sends explorator fleets into the depths, seeking lost treasures from the dark age of technology. When a lost dreadnought is found, the question immediately becomes, what is its condition? Is the pilot still alive? If so, in what state? Every recovery operation is unique. Every found dreadnought presents its own challenges. The Adeptus Mechanicus approaches these recoveries with a mixture of religious reverence and scientific methodology. To them, the dreadnought is a sacred machine, a fusion of biological and mechanical that represents one of the Omnissiah's greatest gifts to humanity. They will invest enormous resources in recovery operations, deploying specialized teams equipped to handle the most degraded technology. The first step is always to determine if the dreadnought's reactor is still functional. If it is, even at minimal power levels, there's a possibility the pilot lives. Teams approach with extreme caution, aware that millennia of isolation and degradation might have driven the pilot mad, that the machine's spirit might be hostile. That warp corruption could have transformed the dreadnought into something dangerous. They establish communication carefully, broadcasting on all frequencies, hoping that some part of the dreadnought's communication systems still functions. Sometimes they receive responses, though these responses are often disturbing. Garbled messages that repeat the same words endlessly. Screams, fragments of battle litanies spoken in voices degraded by corrupted vox systems. Silence that's somehow worse than noise, suggesting consciousness that can hear but cannot or will not respond. The physical recovery is a delicate operation. A dreadnought that has been exposed to the void for millennia is fragile in ways that seem paradoxical given its apparent massive construction. The armor might be riddled with stress fractures. Moving it carelessly could cause catastrophic structural failure. The life support systems, if still functioning, are maintaining a precarious balance that could be disrupted by changes in temperature, pressure, or orientation. Tech priests work in teams, each specialist focusing on different aspects of the recovery. Some monitor the reactor, ready to provide emergency power if the Dreadnought's own reserves are exhausted. Others analyze the structural integrity, mapping the damage, calculating safe points for attachment of recovery cables. Still others attempt to interface with the Dreadnought's systems, trying to understand what's happening inside the sarcophagus. If the pilot is found to be alive, the next question is whether they can be safely revived to full consciousness. In many cases, the answer is no. The damage is too extensive, the corruption too deep, the psychological trauma too severe. Attempting to wake them fully would result in either immediate death or a kind of madness that serves no one. In such cases, the Mechanicus might choose to maintain the Dreadnought in its current state, minimal consciousness, barely aware, while they work to stabilize the systems. This can take months or even years, slowly replacing components, updating systems, gradually bringing the Dreadnought back to something approaching functionality. But some pilots cannot be saved. When the recovery teams open the sarcophagus and find the organic remains, they might discover that death occurred centuries or millennia ago. The life support systems finally failing while the Dreadnought drifted on, carrying a corpse. These discoveries are treated with solemn ritual. The remains are blessed and given whatever final rites are appropriate for their chapter. The gene seed, that precious genetic legacy, might still be viable even in a long-dead pilot. The Mechanicus will attempt recovery, using every technology at their disposal to extract and preserve it. If successful, this gene seed can be returned to the pilot's chapter, allowing their genetic legacy to continue even though they themselves are long dead. More troubling are the Dreadnoughts found to contain pilots who have been completely corrupted by the warp. These are handled with extreme caution. The Ordo Malleus, the inquisitorial order that specializes in demonic threats, is often called in to assess whether the Dreadnought can be purified or must be destroyed. These corrupted Dreadnoughts are dangerous. The pilot, driven mad by millennia of warp exposure, might be actively hostile. The Dreadnought itself might be possessed, the machine's spirit replaced or subsumed by a demonic entity. Weapons that haven't functioned for millennia might suddenly activate, powered by warp energies rather than conventional reactors. The very metal of the hull might have properties that defy natural law, regenerating damage, or growing spikes and blades that weren't part of the original design. Destroying these corrupted Dreadnoughts is not simple. They're built to withstand the most intense firepower. The Mechanicus is reluctant to destroy any technology if it can be avoided. But the danger of allowing a corrupted Dreadnought to exist, potentially spreading its corruption to other machines, often outweighs the value of the technology. The purification rituals, if attempted, are extensive. The Dreadnought is dismantled piece by piece, each component examined for corruption, blessed, and if necessary, melted down and reforged. The pilot, if they can be removed from the sarcophagus alive, undergoes exorcism, their mind scoured for demonic influence. Few survive this process intact. But what of the Dreadnoughts that are successfully recovered with their pilots alive and uncorrupted? These are treasures beyond price. Ancient warriors who fought in battles that have passed into legend, who can provide first-hand accounts of times long forgotten, who possess tactical knowledge and experience accumulated over lifetimes of service. The chapter that lost them, if it still exists after the millennia of drift, treats their recovery as a miracle. Ancient brothers returned from presumed death, bearing witness to the chapter's history. They are honored, revered, their sarcophagi polished and decorated with scrollwork describing their ordeal. But these pilots are never the same as they were before they were lost. The psychological damage cannot be fully healed. They speak of things that make no sense. Memories corrupted by millennia of hallucination mixing with reality until they can no longer distinguish between them. Their time perception is permanently distorted. They might refer to events that happened thousands of years ago, as if they occurred yesterday. Some of these recovered pilots request to be returned to permanent stasis, unable to bear consciousness after their ordeal. Others accept being awakened for battle, finding in combat the only meaning that still makes sense to them. But they're never deployed as frequently as other dreadnoughts. The risk of their damaged psyches breaking completely under the stress of battle is too great. The Mechanicus studies these recovered dreadnoughts intensively, trying to understand how the systems degraded, how they managed to sustain life for so long, what can be learned to improve future designs. They document every detail, creating archives that might someday allow the construction of dreadnoughts that could truly function for millennia without maintenance. But there's a darker use for some recovered dreadnoughts. Those found in the most degraded states, barely functional, their pilots on the edge of complete dissolution. These become test subjects. The Mechanicus wants to understand the limits of the technology, how far a dreadnought can be pushed before total failure. They keep these barely living dreadnoughts in controlled conditions, monitoring the slow degradation, learning from the process. This research is classified as heresy by some within the Imperium, treating ancient warriors as experimental subjects rather than honored brothers. But the Mechanicus argues that the knowledge gained could save lives in the future, could prevent other pilots from experiencing the same suffering. The debate continues. While the test subjects slowly deteriorate in Mechanicus research facilities, their consciousness fading, while cogitators record every detail of their decline. The recovery of a lost dreadnought should be a story of redemption, of a warrior saved and returned to service. But the reality is more complicated, more tragic. What is recovered is often a shell, a broken thing that resembles what it once was, but has been fundamentally altered by its experience. The warrior who was lost is not the warrior who is found. They cannot be. The void and time have changed them at every level, and no amount of ritual or technology can restore what has been lost. Variations in fate, different patterns, different dooms, not all dreadnoughts are created equal. The various patterns, each developed in different eras and with different technologies, face different challenges when lost in the void. Understanding these variations reveals much about the sophistication and limitations of the Imperium's technology. The Castroferum pattern. The most common dreadnought chassis in the 41st millennium was designed for practicality and maintainability. It uses adaptable thermic reactors that are well understood by even moderately skilled tech marines. Its systems are robust but not particularly advanced. When a Castroferum is lost in space, it relies on this robust simplicity for survival. The advantage of the Castroferum is that its systems are less likely to fail catastrophically. The components are overbuilt, designed with redundancy. The thermic reactor can operate at very low power levels for extended periods. A lost Castroferum might function for 1,000 years or more on minimal power, keeping the pilot in a state of barely conscious hibernation. But the disadvantage is that the Castroferum has no advanced self-repair systems. When components fail, they stay failed. There's no automated maintenance, no machine spirit sophisticated enough to route around damaged systems. The degradation is steady and ultimately fatal, just slower than it might be in more advanced but more fragile designs. The Contemptor pattern presents a stark contrast. These ancient war machines, relics from the Great Crusade, incorporate technologies that modern tech priests can barely maintain, let alone repair. Their atomantic arc reactors can generate more power from less fuel. Their atomantic shields provide protection beyond what standard armor offers. Their systems include self-diagnostic and limited self-repair capabilities. A lost Contemptor might survive significantly longer than a Castroferum under the same conditions. The self-repair systems can address minor damage, reroute around failed components, optimize power consumption. The sophisticated machine spirit can make decisions about power allocation that extend the reactor's fuel reserves. But this sophistication comes with vulnerability. If critical systems fail, systems that the self-repair mechanisms cannot fix, the entire dreadnought can cascade into total failure much faster than a simpler design. And the warp seems to have a particular hunger for ancient technology, perhaps because it contains echoes of the dark age of technology when humanity challenged the gods themselves. Contemptors drifting in space are more likely to be corrupted, their sophisticated machine spirits providing more purchase for demonic influence. When recovered, they're more likely to be found in states of advanced corruption, the pilot's mind twisted, the machine itself transformed into something that combines the mechanical with the daemonic in ways that horrify even the mechanicus. The Dreadnought pattern, designed for heavy fire support, faces challenges related to its specialized role. Its power consumption is higher even in standby mode due to the advanced targeting systems. A lost Dreadnought depletes its fuel reserves faster, giving the pilot less time before the final darkness comes. But the Dreadnought's advanced sensors mean that its pilot experiences degradation differently. Where a Castroferrum pilot might lose visual acuity as optical systems fail, a Dreadnought pilot has multiple redundant sensor systems. They can continue to perceive their environment through radar, through thermal sensors, through electromagnetic detection. Long after their optical systems have failed, this could be a mercy or a curse. The ability to continue sensing the universe might provide stimulation that prevents total sensory deprivation madness. Or it might simply extend the suffering, allowing the pilot to remain aware of their situation when they would be better served by the numbness of total sensory failure. The Leviathan pattern. Those massive siege dreadnoughts built for the most intense combat present unique challenges. Their power requirements are enormous even at rest. The sophisticated systems that allow them to carry such heavy weapons and armor require constant power draw just to maintain readiness. A lost Leviathan likely has the shortest survival time of any dreadnought pattern. The reactor, even at minimal power, burns through fuel trying to maintain systems that were designed for intensive combat operations, not for millennia of drift. But in the time the pilot has, they experience their isolation differently than pilots of lighter patterns. The Leviathan's massive armor provides better protection against micrometeoroid impacts and radiation. The pilot might remain physically protected longer, their organic remains better preserved. But this means they potentially remain conscious longer while their systems fail, experiencing each stage of degradation with terrible clarity. Chaos dreadnoughts, those fallen warriors who turn to the ruinous powers, face different challenges entirely. When lost in the void, they're already corrupted, already touched by the warp. For them, drifting through space might be less of a trauma and more of an opportunity. The warp's influence on a chaos dreadnought is not necessarily destructive. It might sustain the machine, providing power when the reactor fails, repairing damage through means that defy natural law. The pilot doesn't experience isolation in the same way because the warp provides constant stimulation, voices of daemons, visions of impossible realms. But this comes at a cost. The chaos dreadnought drifting in space accumulates corruption faster, becoming less machine and more daemon with each passing century. The pilot's consciousness might persist, but it becomes increasingly alien, less human or transhuman and more an appendage of whatever chaos god has claimed them. When these chaos dreadnoughts are eventually found, they're incredibly dangerous. They might have been drifting for millennia, accumulating power, becoming demonic entities of terrifying strength. They might emerge from space hulks as princes of chaos, no longer needing the mechanical body that once sustained them, but using it as a vessel for their daemonic essence. There are also variant patterns created by specific chapters for specific purposes. The Iron Hand's use of bionic integration in their dreadnoughts might provide advantages in surviving system degradation. The Blood Angels, librarian dreadnoughts might use psychic powers to protect themselves from warp corruption. The Space Wolves' unique designs might incorporate technologies that make them more resilient or more vulnerable in ways unique to their implementation. Each variation tells us something about the underlying philosophy of the chapter that uses it and the technology that created it. The brutal practicality of the Castroferrum reflects the Imperium's descent from advanced understanding to cargo, cult maintenance. The sophisticated elegance of the Contemptor speaks to a time when humanity knew more, built better, dreamed larger. And all of them, regardless of pattern or variation, face the same ultimate fate when lost in the void. Some last longer, some fail faster, some experience different kinds of degradation and corruption. But in the end, the result is the same. Consciousness in a metal shell, drifting through infinity, slowly dying over a span of time that makes a mockery of any mortal concept of endurance. The pattern determines the how, the when, the specific nature of the degradation. But it cannot change the fundamental horror of the experience, the isolation, the slow dissolution of self, the final darkness. These are constants across all variations, universal truths of consciousness trapped in machines that were never meant to sustain it for so long. The oldest warrior, Jorn, and the question of endurance. To understand what truly happens to a dreadnought over vast spans of time, we must examine the oldest known example still in service. Jorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves chapter has been entombed in his dreadnought sarcophagus for over 10,000 years. He fought during the Great Crusade. He walked alongside Primarch Liman Russ. He witnessed the Emperor before his interment in the Golden Throne. Jorn is a living link to an age of legend. But Jorn's experience is fundamentally different from that of a dreadnought lost in space. And understanding these differences illuminates what makes the lost dreadnought's fate so terrible. Jorn spends the vast majority of his existence in stasis. He is awakened only once every 1,000 years to hold court at the Great Feast, or when his chapter faces a crisis that requires his ancient wisdom. This means that of his 10,000 years of existence, he has been consciously aware for perhaps a few decades at most, scattered across the millennia. Stasis is not sleep as mortals understand it. It's not unconsciousness. It's a state where time itself becomes irrelevant to the one experiencing it. Jorn is sealed in his stasis vault, and from his perspective, he closes his eyes and immediately opens them again, even if centuries have passed outside. He experiences no passage of time, no sensory input, no thought or dream. He simply is not, in any functional sense, during his time in stasis. This is the key difference. A dreadnought lost in space has no stasis vault. The pilot remains conscious, or at least some degraded version of conscious, throughout their entire drift. Where Jorn experiences, perhaps 50 years of conscious existence spread across 10 millennia, the lost pilot experiences every second of every one of those 10,000 years. Jorn's dreadnought receives constant maintenance. Every time he awakens, tech, Marines service his systems, replace degraded components, update corrupted software, anoint him with sacred oils and speak the rites that please the machine spirit. His chassis is one of the most sophisticated ever built, incorporating technologies that even his chapter's tech Marines don't fully understand, but they maintain it through ritual and reverence. The lost dreadnought receives no maintenance. Systems degrade and are never repaired. Components fail and are never replaced. The machine's spirit, if such exists, receives no appeasement, no prayers, no acknowledgement. It is neglected in the most absolute sense possible. Jorn is surrounded by his chapter. When he awakens, he sees his brothers, hears their voices, knows that he is part of something larger than himself. He serves a purpose. His wisdom is valued, his experience essential. He is not isolated. He is honored. The lost pilot has none of this. They are alone in a way that Jorn has never experienced. No voices except their own thoughts and hallucinations. No purpose except the basic biological imperative to survive. No honor, no reverence, just abandonment and the slow march toward oblivion. Jorn's personality has been preserved across millennia through a combination of stasis and his own indomitable will. He remains recognizably himself, bitter and sullen, quick to anger, but fundamentally the same warrior who served under Russ. His memories are largely intact. He can tell stories of the Great Crusade with clarity, describe battles that happened 10,000 years ago as if they occurred yesterday. This preservation is only possible because of the stasis, because of the maintenance, because of the social connection that reinforces his sense of identity. Without these, Jorn would have degraded like the lost pilots do. His consciousness would have fractured, his memories corrupted, his personality eroded until nothing remained but a pattern of damaged thoughts in damaged tissue. When we see Jorn, we see the best possible outcome of Dreadnought internment. A warrior who has served for 10 millennia, who has witnessed history, who remains a vital part of his chapter's identity. This is the promise that interment offers, the honor that makes space marines accept the sarcophagus. But when we see a Dreadnought recovered after millennia adrift, we see the worst outcome. A warrior who has suffered for 10 millennia, who has been damaged beyond recognition, who serves as a warning rather than an inspiration. This is the reality that the promise obscures, the cost that few consider when accepting the honor of interment. Jorn proves that a Dreadnought can persist for 10,000 years or more. His existence demonstrates that the technology, when properly maintained and the pilot properly cared for, can sustain consciousness across timescales that dwarf individual human lifespans. But he also proves, by contrast, how essential that maintenance and care is. Without stasis, without maintenance, without purpose and connection, the same span of time becomes a horror rather than an honor. Jorn's 10,000 years of service are glorious, because most of that time he was mercifully unconscious, and his periods of consciousness were meaningful. A pilot lost in space for 10,000 years experiences the opposite. They are conscious for all of that time, or at least until their mind breaks completely, and none of it is meaningful. They serve no purpose, accomplish nothing, exist only to suffer as their systems slowly fail and their mind slowly disintegrates. If Jorn were to encounter a Dreadnought that had drifted for 10,000 years, what would he think? He, who has endured so long, who has seen so much, what would he make of a warrior who endured the same span of time, but under such different conditions? Perhaps he would see in the broken, corrupted thing before him a vision of what he could have become. Perhaps he would understand, with the clarity that 10,000 years of wisdom provides, how fine the line is between honored ancient and forgotten wreck. Perhaps he would advocate for the lost pilot's destruction, recognizing that what remains is too damaged to save, that mercy demands an end to suffering that has gone on far too long. Or perhaps he would see a kindred spirit, another warrior who endured beyond all reason, and he would insist on their preservation despite the damage. He might argue that if he can be valued despite his age and his bitterness, then this lost warrior deserves the same consideration, the same effort at preservation and recovery. We cannot know. The question is hypothetical. But it illuminates the central tragedy of the lost Dreadnought's fate. They achieve the same immortality as Jorn, the same persistence of consciousness across millennia, but without any of the factors that make that immortality bearable. They get the cost without the honor, the suffering without the service, the endurance without the purpose. But Jorn the Fell, handed as the Imperium's proudest example of what a Dreadnought can be. But the lost pilots drifting through space for millennia are what a Dreadnought becomes when stripped of everything that gives their extended existence meaning. They are Jorn's dark reflection, the same technology applied to the same purpose, but producing opposite outcomes, based entirely on whether the warrior is cared for or abandoned. The theology of torment, the Imperium of man, is built on faith. The imperial cult teaches that the God Emperor watches over humanity, that he protects and guides his subjects. That service to him is the highest calling any human can aspire to. The Space Marines, as the Emperor's angels of death, are the ultimate expression of this service. Their entire existence is structured around duty, loyalty, and sacrifice. So what does it mean when a Space Marine, transformed into a Dreadnought to serve the Emperor, beyond the limitations of mortal flesh, is abandoned to drift in space for thousands of years? What theological implications does this suffering have? The standard imperial doctrine would frame this as a test. The warrior endures terrible suffering, but this suffering has meaning because it's in service to the Emperor. Their faith is tested by isolation and despair, but if they maintain their loyalty, if they continue to believe in the Emperor's plan, even as they float alone in the void, then their suffering becomes sacred. It becomes a kind of martyrdom, an extended sacrifice that demonstrates the depth of their devotion. This interpretation offers comfort to those who hear of such fates. It transforms tragedy into triumph, makes suffering bearable by imbuing it with purpose. The ecclesiarchy, the religious authorities of the imperial cult, would preach sermons about the lost Dreadnought who maintained faith despite abandonment, whose consciousness persisted in service to the emperor even when no living soul knew of their existence. But this interpretation rings hollow when examined closely. What test requires thousands of years of isolation and degradation? What purpose is served by a warrior's slow descent into madness? Their consciousness eroded by time, and the void until nothing remains but suffering. If this is the emperor's plan, then the plan seems needlessly cruel. The pilot might believe, in their early years of drift, that their situation is indeed a test. They might cling to their faith, recite the litanies they learned as a neophyte, pray to the emperor for strength to endure. This faith might sustain them through the first decades, perhaps even the first century. But after 1,000 years, after 5,000, when their memory is so corrupted they can no longer remember the words of the prayers they're trying to recite, when their mind is so damaged they can no longer form coherent thoughts about what they believe or why, faith becomes difficult to maintain when consciousness itself is dissolving. Some might argue that the suffering of the lost pilot serves a greater purpose we cannot understand, that the emperor, in his divine wisdom, has reasons for allowing this suffering, that from the perspective of a being who existed before the Imperium and who guides the fate of all humanity, the suffering of one warrior over millennia is a small price for some greater good we cannot perceive. This argument is theologically sound within the framework of the imperial cult. It preserves the emperor's perfection and benevolence by placing the failure to understand in the human observer rather than in divine providence. But it offers no comfort to the pilot, who experiences the suffering without understanding its purpose, who endures for millennia without seeing how their endurance serves anything beyond the basic fact of their own persistence. There's a darker theological interpretation, one that few in the Imperium would dare voice, but that must be considered. What if the lost pilot's fate demonstrates not the emperor's providence, but his limitations? What if the god emperor, mighty as he is, cannot actually watch over every one of his servants? What if the Imperium is simply too vast, humanity too numerous, for even a god to prevent individual tragedies, like a dreadnought drifting into the void and being forgotten? This interpretation denies the omniscience and omnipotence that the imperial cult attributes to the emperor. It suggests that the galaxy is too large, too chaotic, too filled with enemies for even the master of mankind to prevent every instance of suffering. The lost pilot is not abandoned by divine will, but by simple logistics, by the impossibility of tracking every asset in a war that spans a galaxy. If this interpretation is true, then the pilot's suffering is meaningless in the most literal sense. It serves no purpose, tests nothing, accomplishes nothing. It's simply what happens when the chaos of war combines with the vastness of space and the limited resources of the Imperium. The pilot was lost not because the emperor willed it or allowed it as a test, but because in a galaxy at war, things get lost. From the perspective of the machine cult, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the situation raises different theological questions. They venerate the omniscire, the machine aspect of the god emperor, and they believe in the divinity of the machine spirit. A dreadnought is the ultimate expression of their theology, a perfect fusion of flesh and machine, each component sanctified and holy. When a dreadnought is lost and its systems degrade, does this represent a failure of the omniscia's design? Or does it demonstrate the consequences of improper maintenance, of the machine spirit being denied the rituals and care it requires? The Mechanicus might argue that the dreadnought's degradation proves the necessity of their order, shows what happens when machines are not properly venerated. But this argument implicitly blames the pilot for their own suffering. It suggests that if they had properly maintained their own systems, if they had performed the correct rituals, they could have prevented the degradation. This is absurd for a pilot who has no ability to perform external maintenance, no way to access their own systems, but the theological logic demands it. There's also the question of the machine's spirit itself. If the Dreadnought contains a semi-conscious entity formed from its mechanical components, what happens to that machine's spirit when the Dreadnought drifts for millennia? Does it suffer as the pilot suffers? Does it go mad as the systems degrade? Does it eventually die, and if so, what does death mean for a machine spirit? The Mechanicus teaches that the machine spirit is immortal as long as the machine exists, but practice suggests otherwise. Ancient machines retrieved from space, Hulks often have machine spirits that are damaged, hostile, or simply absent. Perhaps the machine spirit degrades like the pilot's consciousness, becoming less coherent, less capable, until it's just a collection of erratic impulses, rather than anything that could be called a spirit. The most heretical theological interpretation, one that would result in execution if voiced, is that the lost pilot's fate demonstrates the fundamental wrongness of the Dreadnought technology itself. That attempting to preserve consciousness beyond the span of natural life, even enhanced transhuman life, is inherently against the Emperor's design. That the suffering of lost pilots is the universe's way of punishing this transgression. This interpretation would argue that death is natural and necessary, that the Space Marine's natural lifespan, though extended by genetic modification, has limits for a reason. By attempting to push beyond those limits through interment in a Dreadnought, the Imperium creates situations where consciousness can persist in conditions that no consciousness should have to endure. If this heretical view is correct, then every Dreadnought is a theological mistake, and the lost pilots are simply the most obvious examples of the consequences. Their suffering is not meaningful or purposeful, but rather the inevitable result of trying to preserve consciousness beyond the point where it can be sustained humanly. None of these theological interpretations can be proven or disproven. The Emperor, if he is conscious within the Golden Throne, does not speak clearly on such matters. The warp offers no objective truth, only the subjective experiences of those who encounter it. The machine god, if such an entity exists distinct from the Emperor, provides no clear guidance. So the question remains open, a wound in the Imperium's theological certainty. What does it mean when a warrior in service to the Emperor experiences millennia of suffering? Is it sacred, or is it simply sadistic? Is it purposeful, or is it merely the consequence of war's chaos? Is it the Emperor's will, or the Emperor's failure to prevent it? The pilot, drifting in the void, their mind fragmenting across the centuries, cannot answer these questions. They can only endure, and in their endurance, force those who hear of their fate to confront uncomfortable truths about faith, about duty, about the price of service in a universe where the gods themselves seem indifferent to suffering. The ultimate answer, 1,000 variations of loss. We have examined the physics, the psychology, the corruption, and the theology of a Dreadnought lost in space for thousands of years. But what is the actual answer to the question we began with? What happens? The truth is that there is no single answer. Every lost Dreadnought experiences a unique combination of factors that determine their fate. The pattern of their construction, the nature of the space they drift through, the duration of their isolation, the strength of their faith, the random chance of warp influence. All of these variables combine to create countless different outcomes. Some pilots die quickly, their reactors failing within the first century, their consciousness extinguishing long before physical degradation becomes extreme. These are perhaps the fortunate ones. They experience isolation and fear, but not the utter dissolution of self that comes with millennia of drift. Others persist for thousands of years, their systems degrading slowly, but their consciousness remaining relatively intact until the final failure. These pilots experience the full horror of the situation, aware enough throughout to understand what's happening to them, to count the years and centuries, to watch their own slow death approach. Some are corrupted by the warp, transformed into servants of chaos, their suffering ended but their souls damned. They might emerge from their ordeal as powerful entities, Dreadnoughts that have transcended their mechanical limitations through daemonic fusion. Others resist corruption, but are driven mad by isolation. their minds breaking into fragments that persist separately, like multiple personalities trapped in the same skull. When recovered, these pilots speak in different voices, claim different identities, remember contradictory histories. Some are never recovered. They drift forever, or until their hulls are eventually destroyed by impacts with larger objects, by falling into stars, by the gradual accumulation of damage over time scales measured in geological rather than historical terms. Others are found but too late, their pilots long dead, only empty shells remaining. These become relics, memorials to warriors whose names might be remembered, even though their consciousness is long gone. A few, a very few, are recovered relatively intact. These pilots have experienced something no one else in the Imperium has endured and survived with their sanity approximately intact. They become treasured sources of wisdom, though their wisdom is often dark, colored by their experience of abandonment and isolation. The common thread through all these variations is suffering. However long the pilot survives, however their particular combination of circumstances plays out, they suffer. The isolation is suffering. The sensory deprivation is suffering. The degradation of their systems is suffering. The corruption, if it comes, is suffering. Even death, when it finally arrives, might be suffering if the soul is claimed by chaos rather than passing to the Emperor. There are no happy endings for lost dreadnoughts. Even recovery is tainted by the damage the pilot has suffered, by what they've lost during their time in the void. They are never restored to what they were. They are salvaged, preserved perhaps, but not saved. The warrior who was lost is gone, replaced by something that has survived, but been fundamentally altered by survival. And this, perhaps, is the ultimate horror. Not that consciousness can be extinguished, not that suffering can occur, but that consciousness can persist through conditions that should extinguish it. That suffering can continue far beyond the point where it should end. The human mind, even enhanced and modified as a space marine's is, was never meant to exist in isolation for thousands of years. The technology that preserves it in those conditions doesn't rescue it, it tortures it. The Dreadnought was created as a way to allow warriors to continue serving beyond the point where their bodies could no longer fight. It was meant as an honor, a way to extend service, to preserve wisdom and experience. But when that extension continues in isolation, when there's no service to perform, no battles to fight, no purpose except the basic biological fact of continued existence, it becomes a curse that can last for thousands of years. A curse that transforms consciousness itself into a burden. A curse that demonstrates perhaps more clearly than anything else in the Imperium's arsenal the fundamental horror of existence in the 41st millennium. Because in the end, what happens when a dreadnought floats in space for thousands of years? Is this a consciousness designed to serve the Emperor experiences the opposite of service? It experiences abandonment. It experiences the slow realization that the honor it accepted has become torture. It experiences the universe's utter indifference to its suffering, to its continued existence, to its eventual extinction. The stars wheel overhead, indifferent. The void surrounds, uncaring. Time passes at scales that mock human understanding. And somewhere in that vast darkness, sealed in metal, floating alone, a warrior who once fought for mankind slowly stops being a warrior, stops being human, stops being anything except suffering waiting for an end that might never come. This is what happens. This is the answer. It's not the answer anyone wants to hear. Not the answer that fits comfortably into the Imperium's narrative of honor and service. But it's the truth revealed by physics and psychology, and the cruel mathematics of time operating on consciousness never meant to endure it. The dreadnought floats, the pilot suffers. The universe continues. And the only meaning in any of it is the meaning we impose afterward, the stories we tell about the warrior who endured, because we cannot accept that their suffering might simply be suffering, without purpose, without redemption, without end. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40k's darkest concepts, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the grim darkness of the far future, and I'd love to have you along for the journey. Thank you for watching, And remember, in the 41st millennium, even immortality is a curse.